speakers. Can you hear it now? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Kathy Jack, our president, is right in front of me in the stripes. And Marianne Collins is going to help us tonight also. I don't see Marianne. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Well, we welcome you. And 4 years ago, we walked this cemetery, but we did not know we had a videotape of that. I think Tom was our videographer at the time, and he didn't remind us that we had a video. So we all see him tonight, and he's going to give us that video when he's done.
Yeah, Jane, you have to hold it right up.
Right there.
Right
Okay?
there. That's the only place it'll work.
COVID, I don't want to spit on it. Okay.
Microphone doesn't count.
So we're going to repeat the walk tonight, and so that we'll be able to put the video up on our webpage. Also, the cemetery is very important because it's an important part of Grove City's history. Just a little background on this cemetery. It was organized in 1846, but many of the graves were already in place at that time. Possibly the oldest grave was that of, the oldest one in Mercer County is found here, the grave of Margaret Cunningham, who was wife of the founder of Grove City, Valentine Cunningham. Her date of death is 1800, occurring just 2 years after she and her husband arrived here. This is where we will start the walk in the back of the cemetery. So if you follow Kathy, she'll lead you back to Margaret and Valentine. Valentine's there, Margaret's there. Thank you. Son is over here. Valentine was born in 1771 and Margaret in 1775 in Huntington, Pennsylvania, which is in central PA. In 1798, Valentine, Margaret, and their 2 sons traveled to this area to claim a free parcel of land offered to white settlers in Mercer County. Valentine and his brother-in-law, Robert Glenn, who was also Margaret's brother, built a grist mill along Wolf Creek in the area near today's Grove City football field, not far from here. The grist mill was needed to process the crops of the farmers living in the surrounding area. That same year, 1798, their daughter Elizabeth was born. Margaret named their new settlement Pine Grove because of the pines surrounding their cabin. Just 2 years later, in 1800, Margaret died. She was only 25. She makes that long journey, founds this town, and she dies. In 1802, Valentine built a log cabin to serve as a school for his children and the local children, and he died in 1804 at the age of 32 of unknown causes. And his children went to live with their maternal grandparents, the Glens in Plain Grove Township. Right back here we have the Tidballs, James and Elizabeth Cunningham Tidball. Elizabeth was born in 1798 to Valentine and Margaret Cunningham shortly after they arrived in this area. She was married to James Tidball, who had a tannery along Wolf Creek. The couple lived in Grove City's oldest still standing house on Liberty Street. Do you all know where that is? Okay. Wonderful house. We have a picture of it here that fell over. Where'd that go? Oh, Marianne's got it. Great. She's walking around with it. It's also known as the Young House. The couple lived there, and it contained the first post office, a grocery store, and Pine Grove Select School that later became Grove City College. That was a lot for one building. There's a photo that she's walking around, and you can go, it's right at the curve in the road on Liberty at 455 Liberty. They had 3 children, Charles, whose grave is beside his father's grave, Valentine, and Phoebe. In 1853, James sold the tannery to William Young. The tannery process included stretching the hides like trampolines over deep pits to dry the hides. Elizabeth died in 1877 at the age of 79. Charles died in 1864, his age unknown, since his birth date is unknown. We're going to move over in this direction, where Kathy is. Here we have the grave of Elizabeth Cunningham Tidball and James Tidball. I'm sorry. Elizabeth, yes. Stevenson Van Eman. Elizabeth was born in 1832. She was married to Dr. Nicholas Wiley Van Eman, who was one of Pine Grove's first 2 physicians. Also here are the graves of 2 of their children, Rebecca and John. Her husband is buried in Vandalia, Virginia. If you're wondering why, here's the story. After the Civil War, Van Eman was tempted into a very unwise business venture. A wheeler-dealer from the South convinced Van Eman that he should trade a piece of his underdeveloped property here for a so-called wonderful plantation in Virginia. He agreed to the transaction and moved his family to a piece of unproductive land in Vandalia, Virginia. Since he could not farm the land, he resorted back to his profession as a doctor. He deeply regretted this move as he missed their former home near the banks of Wolf Creek. One night, while returning home after treating a patient, he fell asleep while driving his buggy. The horse was frightened by an approaching train, which caused the buggy to tip over an embankment. He was not killed instantly, but later died from his injuries. When his son, who lived in Pine Grove, since he had returned there to marry his childhood sweetheart, heard of his father's death, he sent for his mother and siblings to return to Pine Grove and live with them. There's another interesting story with Elizabeth. She was a very devout Presbyterian, and she made a bargain when she was young with God. She was having trouble bearing children. In those times, infant mortality rates were very high. Elizabeth had previously lost 2 babies and was expecting again. And she prayed to God as a stern and righteous but merciful God that if he would spare the life of her unborn child, she would dedicate him to the Lord. Her prayers were answered, and her son, Robert Clarence, lived to be the oldest of her 7 children and was a minister in the Northern Presbyterian Assembly. Elizabeth died in 1907 at the age of 75. Okay, here we are at the grave of Jacob Covert. He was born in 1787 and died in 1869 at the age of 82. He served as a musician in the War of 1812. He was married to Mary Ann Cornelius Covert, and they had 12 children, and the youngest is also buried here, Maggie. Okay, now we're going to go to another Jacob Covert, all the way over there. So Jacob DeKalb Covert, right, it's the orange stone back here. He was the son of Jacob and Mary Ann, and he was born in 1829. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and he was a farmer. He was married to Sarah Covert, and they had 6 children. The story of how he died is that he had just finished helping a neighbor stack hay and was returning home in his horse-drawn buggy. The reins slipped from his hands, and his horse became frightened and took off running. Jacob attempted to jump from the buggy, but his foot became entangled in the reins, and he was dragged some 20 feet. At first, his injuries were thought not to be fatal, but later he died, probably from internal bleeding, and he died in 1899 at the age of 70. Okay. This is one of my favorites, James W. and wife Emma Hunter. James was born in 1863. His father, also James, came here to Pine Grove to homestead 65 acres. Son James later expanded the farm to 300 acres and sold milk at 5 cents a quart. At that time, he had no idea that his farm would be chosen as the location for Grove City's sewage plant. Horrible. He was not happy with the decision, and he withheld his approval, hoping that he could persuade the Borough Council to locate the proposed sewage plant further downstream from his farm. Even after construction was underway, Mr. Hunter continued to seek damages. He believed his farm to be worth $25,000, but the Borough Committee offered him $6,000, which he refused. The needed acreage for the sewage plant was eventually taken by eminent domain, and we are unsure how much James received for his land. And all the waste in the town was flowing in this direction, so that was another reason, you know. But because of the proximity of the sewage plant to his barn, he was unable to continue selling milk to the creamery, as it would not pass the required inspection. James died in 1938 at the age of 74. In 1969, the Hunter farm gave the farm to the borough. And so today that's a wonderful park now where the kids play soccer, and the bicycle path and the walking path that goes down the creek. So it had a little bit of a revival. This next one is the grave of Jean-Baptiste Louis Masson. And he was born in France in 1850. And Jean, though he liked to be called Louis, we're calling him John tonight because his father and his brother were both named Louis. He came to Mercer County in 1835 along with his father, Louis, and brother, Louis and Joseph. He married Margaret Gregg of Grove City, and they had 4 children. In 1888, Louis was on a ship traveling to his homeland of France when the ship drifted on an island, and Louis lost his trunk and effects. Jean-Louis died in 1889 at the age of 74. The next grave where Kathy's walking was that of Martha Jane, who was known as Jenny, Porter Campbell. She was born in 1814, one of 12 children of Andrew and Anne Lowry Porter. Jenny married James Campbell on January 23, 1838. Over time, she lost several children during pregnancy. So Jenny's husband purchased a rocking chair for his wife and told her to sit and rest each day. This rest and relaxation seemed to work and resulted in the birth of their son, Newton, in 1842. Newton was their only child. But at age 20, he married, and he and his wife had 17 children, so they kind of made up for it. Mary Jane Jenny died in 1889 at the age of 75. Okay, the next stone is the smallest one here we have tonight, and this is the stone of Kenneth Phillips. And Marianne's got a photograph of this child. Kenneth was born on February 9th, 1912, and died on October, 8 months later. He was the youngest son of Joseph and Eva Mae Phillips. The records indicate that he died of pulmonary bronchitis. His funeral was held in the residence of his maternal grandmother, Mary Eates. It was often customary at the time to take pictures of the deceased. And here you see him. I believe he's in his grandmother's home. The family paid $18 for its tiny casket, which was made by the C.A. Black Furniture and Undertaking business that was located at 235 Broad Street. That was the norm in the day for the furniture makers to make the coffins as well. Okay, now we're going to head over in that direction. It's Edward Deniston. This is his grave here with his wife, Mary J. Edward was born in 1816 in Springfield Township. He was the son of Alexander Deniston and Nancy Hannah. Alexander emigrated from Ireland and served in the War of 1812. He was a millwright and farmer and held offices of school director, supervisor, and auditor of Liberty Township, and also justice of the peace. He was also an elder of the Reformed Church of Amsterdam in Liberty Township. He died in 1900 at the age of 84. Over here we have the Rose family. Julia Rose is buried here near her brother William and his wife Margaret. Julia was born in 1816 to Andrew Rose Jr. of Philadelphia. Her mother, Isabel Wood, died when Julia was only 14. She never married and lived with her niece, Margaret Rose Steele. She died in 1873 at the age of 56. And her father was the great-great-grandfather of President William McKinley. There's also a Rose Cemetery in our community, which is on private property. William Woods, he had the nickname Woods, but his name was William Rose, was born in 1811, and he was the second son of Andrew Rose Jr. and Isabella Woods. Woods inherited his father's 100-acre farm in Pine Township. Woods and Margaret had no children of their own, but they raised their niece, Julia Ann Rose, after the death of Julia's mother, Mary Ann Richmond Rose, in 1841. In 1854, Woods was a candidate for county school superintendent but he withdrew because he did not like the $400 salary. Just about $1 a day. Woods Rose died in 1906 at the age of 78. And Margaret Laramie Rose was called Maggie. She was born in 1828 of Irish parents. She was married to William Woods Rose.
Is it turning off and on? You want me to get the one plugged in there?
Well, we'll see. She died in 1906 at the age of 78.
Okay, now
Okay.
we're gonna, if you follow this way along here, we're gonna go up on the hill.
George Washington Thompson and Emmeline Cunningham Thompson are buried here. George Washington Thompson was born in 1835 in New Jersey. The 1870 census shows 35-year-old George living in a hotel in the borough of Mercer, and he was working as a farmer. He met Emmeline, and they were married 3 years later. The 1900 census shows that he was a carpet weaver. He died in 1913 at the age of 78. Emmeline was the daughter of Valentine and Margaret's son, Charles, and Mary Ann McClintock Cunningham. Emmeline was born in 1847. She was living with her daughter, Grace Wolcott, and grandson Paul in Butler when she died of apoplexy, which Heather looked that up, that's a stroke, at the age of 81 in 1928. Over where Kathy is standing, yeah, there's a group of Cunninghams. And I'm going to start with Margaret. She was the wife of the Squire Cunningham. We looked that up and saw that a squire could have been a justice of the peace. He had many different things he could do. Not sure why James Cunningham was called the squire, but he was. But Margaret is the first grave. She was born in 1826. She was his daughter. I say his wife, she was his daughter. And Elizabeth Whittaker Cunningham. And granddaughter of Valentine and Margaret Glenn Cunningham. She was married to Abraham Calvin Black, Jr., and they had 6 known children. Margaret's husband, Abraham, died in 1862 in a prison camp in the South during the Civil War. He is buried in Arlington Cemetery. Margaret died in 1898 at the age of 72. Here we have the one grave of James Glenn Cunningham on one side, and then on the back side is his wife, Margaret Glenn Cunningham. James was born in 1796 in Huntington County. I apologize, it's Elizabeth, his wife. His parents were Valentine and Margaret Glenn Cunningham.
Keep all these Cunningham straight.
It's essay. You can write it in
As mentioned earlier, James, at the age of 8, and his siblings went to live with the Glenn grandparents in Plain Grove Township after his parents died. James and his wife, Elizabeth Whittaker, it's on the back side, lived in Wolf Creek Township and had a large family of 9 known children. James was well known as Squire Cunningham. When he was 16, he was a cabinet maker, apprenticed for Benjamin Wood. After 20 years of working in cabinet making, he changed occupations to milling. Milling is the process of using a machine to cut and shape various materials. Squire owned a milling business for 50 years. He also held several civil positions, including county auditor, county commissioner, school director, township auditor, and justice of the peace. During an interview in 1888, shortly before he died, Squire, who at the time was struggling with cancer that proved to be fatal, was quoted as saying to his physician, "I am like an old wagon, doctor. If you can occasionally put in a new spoke or part of a felloe, it will help me run the vehicle a little longer. If you can't, it's all right." The doctor replied, "But don't you talk too much and become weary," in which Squire replied, "The tongue is the best and strongest part of the wagon." James died on his birthday in 1888 at the age of 92. And the last, no, we have two more. The Cunningham clan here. Stone here. This is his wife, Elizabeth, Squire's wife. Was born, I got that all mixed up. Sorry about that.
Okay.
She was born in 1810. She and the Squire were married when she was only 15 years old, and then they had 9 children. She died in 1890 at the age of 80.
Then this one here is Elizabeth Ferguson Cunningham Welch.
Correct. Elizabeth Ferguson Cunningham Welch. Elizabeth was born in 1834. Her grandparents were Valentine and Margaret Cunningham, and her parents were James Glenn Cunningham, Valen and Margaret's son, and Elizabeth Whitaker Cunningham. She was married to Bascom Rayan Welch, the first Burgess of Grove City, and the wedding took place in Cunningham Hall in 1854. I believe that building is still on East Main. Grove City had Burgesses up until 1962, and then they began calling them mayors instead. About 10 years later, her husband fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. Together they had 8 children, and she died in 1931 at the age of 97. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to... Yeah.
Okay, and I'll try to remember to keep this up so you can hear me. We're going to move right over here. You don't have to move. You can just listen. Mary Ann will bring the picture around. This is Margaret, they called her, Simpson Winnip. Margaret was a cousin of Ranald's Craig. We're going to talk about Ranald's Craig. He's a very important person in the history of Grove City when we cross over there. But just keep that in mind, that she was his cousin. Growing up, Margaret lived on a farm south of Grove City. She worked as a hired girl for neighboring families. Her brother James followed many others to Sutter's Mill in California to mine for gold. Although he was unsuccessful in finding gold, he moved his mother and sisters to California. There, Margaret met and married John Winnip, and they owned a sheep ranch. After her husband's death, Margaret sold the ranch and moved back to Grove City. According to her niece, Marion McConkey, her aunt told wonderful stories of Donner Pass and Truckee Lake and the wonders of the Golden State. In 1883, at the request of her cousin Reynolds, who was at that time the first secretary of the borough of Grove City, she loaned Grove City Borough $1,000 at 6% interest, and in 1885 renewed the loan for an additional $1,100. In 1886, the Borough Council repaid Margaret the full loan amounting of $2,100. At that time, I'm sure was a good bit of money. Okay, we're going to move down here. Do be careful coming down the hill here.
I'm anxious to hear what they say about it.
Okay, here we have, are we ready?
Yeah.
While we're setting up, I'll tell you, this is a group of the Campbell family. As you kind of noticed in this cemetery, the families did have groupings. We had the Cunninghams in the back, and we had Cunninghams up here, but they have, seem to, have their own little section of the cemetery, which is nice for the family. This is Norman Robert, nicknamed Nor Campbell, right here. Nor was born in 1869, one of 17 children of Newton and Eliza Campbell. A bright child, Norman learned the catechism forward and backwards, and when it came time to recite, he not only answered, but answered questions as well. He hammered out tools in the small blacksmith shop on the farm while he was learning the blacksmith trade in town. Although he farmed and also worked in Pennsylvania oil fields, he eventually returned to Grove City to team for a living. And that means he hauled different things. He had one of the town's finest matched teams. He was living with the Seymour Youngs on Liberty Street when he met Anna May Young, who he married in 1903. They first lived in the top room of the Young house, where Grove City College had its beginning. And that's the house that we showed you the picture of when we started this tour. Together they had 4 children, and Eliza brought 13 to the marriage. Their daughter Mary wrote a history of the Campbell family in which she states her father later learned the chipping trade and was a foundry foreman in her Uncle John's diesel engine shop until he was 68 years old. During the Depression, he kept busy on the WPA projects, that's the Works Progress Administration, in the borough. He died in 1953 at the age of 84. Okay. And we're just going to come right down here. We have a whole group of them right here. Not moving too far. Okay, this is Rebecca A. Paxton Hosek, and her husband Tom Paxton. His memorial is on the other side of hers here. She was a daughter of Tom Paxton from Ireland and Jane Aston. She was born in 1864 and died in 1892 at the age of 27. She was married to William E. Hosek, who died 10 years later and is also buried here. Okay, now this little grave here, you all have to take a look at this as you walk by. It actually has a pounded aluminum piece attached to it because the Shirley Marie DePonso was born on November 14th, 1938, and died just a few weeks later on December 8th, 1938. Her father, James, was an aluminum artist and for Wendell August, made this plaque for his daughter's tombstone. James DePonso was from Chautauqua, New York, and he started working for Wendell August Ford. You have to turn the page. At the age of 17 in 1932. When Arthur Armour left Wendell August to start his own business, which Tom Armour, who's videotaping, that's his father, DePonso went with him and later started his own business as well. In 1955, as the father of 5 adopted children, DePonso began college, eventually earning a master's degree in special education. So when you come by, you'll be able to see that. We have a group right up here. This is the Hess and Dale group here. Henrietta Etta Coulter Hess is one of the daughters of James and Cynthia Rose Coulter. She was born in 1840 and died in 1909 at the age of 68. At the time of the 1900s census, Henrietta was a widow and worked as a nurse for William Brown, age 90, of Slippery Rock. She died at the home of her sister Amanda Dale in Liberty Township. And James Coulter, we have a lot of pictures of the Coulter family. They must have liked early photography. James Coulter, while they're passing him around, it's quite a story here. According to the Coulter family story, James' parents, Richard and Catherine Coulter, emigrated from Scotland to Ireland because Catherine's aristocratic family would not approve of her marrying Richard, who was a fisherman. And then in 1793, they emigrated to America and settled in Franklin Township, where James was born in 1798. He was the third of 5 sons of Richard and Catherine Coulter. Around 1804, the family moved to this area, a wilderness in 1804, and is thought to be one of the earliest families settling in Mercer County. They constructed a 2-story red brick house with bricks that they made right there on the farm. Today, the remains of the brick kiln are buried due to beavers that created damming of Black Run, which was a nearby stream. At one time, water from an artesian well north of the house was piped into the cellar kitchen to keep the milk cans cool, which was probably very, early, innovative at that time. James was married at the age of 25 to Cynthia Rose, and he was a farmer, inheriting the 150-acre farm in what is now Pine Township from his parents. He built a log cabin there where he and his wife spent all their married life and where all their children were born. They had 11 children, 3 of whom died at very young ages. The house, which was later sided and remodeled several times, still stands on the old farmstead south of Grove City. In those early days, sheep were raised for their wool, which were carded, spun, and woven into cloth. James died in 1882 at the age of 84. He and his wife Cynthia's graves cost $28 each. The picture that was found, this picture that Marianne's circulating, was found in a small photo album that belonged to their youngest daughter, Amanda Coulter Dale. Okay, Cynthia Rose Coulter, as I mentioned, was the wife of James Coulter. She was born in 1806. She was the second of 7 daughters of Jacob Rose and Rebecca Clark. Her father Jacob served in the War of 1812, and both of her grandfathers served in the American Revolutionary War. Cynthia's namesake granddaughter, Cynthia Rose McCoy, who died in 1933, remembered her grandmother's funeral in 1881, where her grandmother's elder sons carried their mother's coffins on their shoulders, and the church bell tolled for each of her 75 years of life. Okay, back behind there, are we circulating that yet? Melvina R., nicknamed Vina Coulter. This little white limestone tablet marks the grave of Vina Coulter, the granddaughter of James and Cynthia Coulter. She was the first of 6 children to Richard Lewis Coulter and Mary Jane Stoughton, born in 1858. Vina died tragically in 1876 at the age of 18 from picking and eating mushrooms that proved to be poisonous. And then back behind Vina's is Amanda Marie Coulter Dale. Amanda was born in 1847 and died in 1921 at the age of 74. She was the daughter of James and Cynthia Rose Coulter and was the youngest of their 11 children. At 21, she married David Courtney Dale. They had 1 son, William Coulter Dale. David and Amanda were members of the North Liberty Presbyterian Church. Amanda gave music lessons, and her melodeon is believed to still be in the possession of the Mercer County Historical Society. One early November day, Amanda walked out to a nearby field at the Dale farmstead, 2.5 miles south of Grove City, to look after a flock of turkeys about 200 yards from the house. Here she passed away and was found by her son about an hour later.
Yeah, now we're going to come down here.
This is the one I told you about that we talked about at Margaret's. This is her cousin. Ranald Cowden Craig. Ranald's
We just finished James Coulter. And we're starting with this one now.
Ranald Plowden Craig was born in 1836, the son of David Cochran Craig and Mary Wardle Craig. He was married to Rhoda Cunningham Craig and had 3 daughters. Ranald served in the Civil War in Company B, 40th Regiment of the Pennsylvania Volunteers, and he kept a diary of his service during the Civil War that is now housed at the Grove City Area Historical Society Museum. We have made copies of it, so you're welcome anytime to stop in and sit down and read that diary and experience what Ranald did during his time with the Civil War. Let's see here. He wrote in the last entry in his diary addressed to his wife, "Rest was never more welcome. The scenes of the day were such as I never saw before, and I hope I may never see again. Thus ends a brief sketch of the fight and fills the book. My dear, I am yours truly, R.C. Craig." Following the war, he served as the first secretary of Grove City's Borough Council that was formed in 1883. Ranald was a prominent fundraiser and supporter of the community. He helped raise funds to establish Dr. Isaac Kettler's new college. Ranald died in 1893 at the age of 57.
Okay, I think we can just stay right here. I'm going around the corner here.
Right around the corner here is Private Seymour Craig. As we come down this way, you can see the graves when you walk by here. Seymour was born in 1874 and was the nephew of Ranald Craig. His father was Joseph Alonzo Craig, Ranald's brother, and his mother was Maria Buchanan Craig. Seymour served in the Spanish-American War for the Pennsylvania Volunteers in Company F, 1st Regiment, as a private. He was later awarded the rank of corporal. He served for a very brief period of just 7 months and was honorably discharged. Seymour died in 1950 at the age of 76. Right here. This is James William Spence. James was born in 1870. Oh,
Tom, you might need to take it. The 3 are right here. Here, here, and there. So you might just want to go down there and catch all 3 of them this way.
I think we're going to get it in before it gets dark and before it rains.
Thanks, Kathy.
Well, James William Spence was born in 1817 in Indiana County and died in Mercer County in 1914 at the age of 97. When he was 18 years old, his father died, and he moved his family to what is now Pine Township, settling along the banks of Wolf Creek. According to J.G. White in his 1909 20th Century History of Mercer County, James, being the oldest of the children, assumed the responsibilities of the family, giving him no opportunity to gain a good education, so he could not read or write. He worked on the family farm and later went to teaming, as I mentioned before, that's driving a team of horses to haul goods for different people. When James was 22, he married Maria A. Brewer, his first wife. They and their children resided in Murrayville in Butler County. In 1873, he married his second wife, Hannah Rosenberry McCoy, and they lived in Pine Township. It's noted in his biography that he was very active in his later years, as evident in the birth of his 4 children when he was in his late 50s and early 60s. James was described as a hard-working and industrious citizen and a kind, indulgent father. In politics, he was an independent voter and cast his first vote for Old Hickory Jackson. Okay, right down there is James Clellan, M. Clellan. James was born in 1836. He was the son of David and Mary McClymans Clellan and one of 7 children. He grew up on a farm and received an education in the public schools. He enlisted in Company D, 11th Pennsylvania Volunteers at the outbreak of the Civil War and served for 3 years. He took part in many of the Civil War battles. After returning home at the end of the war, he moved to Harrisville, where he lived until he was 1884. He then moving to Grove City because he believed Grove City had better school advantages for his children. In Grove City, he worked as a lumber merchant. James was married to Sarah Ann Clellen, and they had 2 children. James died at the age of 79 in 1914. According to his obituary, his death occurred due to infirmities of the old age. That's 79. Okay, and our last one is down here. It's Mary Jane Huber Beatty. I'm going to flip you around here. Many of you might know the Beatty family, especially when I mentioned her children's names. Mary Jane Huber Beatty's grave is the most recent featured in our walk. She was born in 1926 in Williamsburg, PA, to Milo N. Huber and Blanche E. Miller. She was a graduate of the former Turtle Creek High School class of 1945. Following high school, she worked during World War II at the Westinghouse plant and later attended Rose City College. She was of the Presbyterian faith and was a homemaker and mother to Bonnie Jean Winder, who preceded her in death and who is buried right beside her, right here. And Russell Beatty and Robert Beatty and Melody Beatty Esposito. Mary Jane enjoyed ballroom dancing and reading, and God forbid if you called during Masterpiece Theater was on TV. According to her obituary, she had been a resident of Liberty Township since 1948, and she died in 2013 at the age of 86. Well, that concludes our walk for tonight. Thank you for attending. I know many of you are familiar faces. If you aren't familiar with, I hope you enjoyed hearing all these stories of our past residents of Grove City. And if you aren't familiar with the Grove City Area Historical Society Museum, we encourage you to visit the museum at 111 College Avenue, where we have 3 floors of our historical collections. We have no admission charge, but we do appreciate donations, and we welcome donations this evening also. I think Doris has the donation bucket there, because we're a nonprofit and we exist completely on memberships and donations, and occasionally a grant, but they're few and far between now. So, we appreciate any help we can get to keep our doors open. And please consider becoming a member of and you'll get newsletters 3 times a year. So I would like to thank Jane, and I would like to thank Jane. Excuse me, let me start over. Jane and I would like to thank Kathy Coulter and Skip Sample, who helped us research for this walk. Tom Armour for taping the walk that will eventually be on our website for viewing. So if you have people that couldn't make it tonight and said, I wish I would have been able to see that cemetery walk, hope within the month it'll be on our website. You can go on our website and view it there. I also want to thank John Inman of Grove City College for loaning us the speaker system, and Tower Church, who maintains the cemetery, and for allowing us to be here for tonight. And at my frantic call last week, I called the secretary and said, can you please have someone come out here and mow because the grass is so high? And they were very good about coming out and mowing for us. So thank you everybody for coming.
You want me to start around?
Okay, is this your camera, Tom?